Hey guys, tonight we're heading into one of the most brutal and unforgiving environments you can imagine: the Arctic air bases during World War II. Picture this: a landscape where the air feels like it could freeze your breath in an instant, where the sun barely rises above the horizon, and where every moment outside your shelter could be a fight for survival. Welcome to the world of soldiers stationed in the Arctic. And guess what? You probably won't survive this. Just kidding. You'll be fine. But it's gonna get real cold. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't want any cold-hearted subscriptions. And hey, share your location and local time in the comments below. I'm always curious to see where our Midnight History crew is from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, it's the middle of a fierce winter during World War II, and you're stationed in one of the most remote, desolate places on Earth, an Arctic air base. Outside, the wind howls across the frozen tundra, dragging snow in all directions, making it feel like the very world is covered in ice. The temperature sits well below freezing, and if you're lucky, you'll only feel the chill in your bones. If you're unlucky, we don't want to be unlucky. Sleeping in these conditions isn't just uncomfortable, it's borderline impossible. But it's a necessity, because when you're stationed up here, rest is as important as any military operation. Your job isn't just to fly planes or keep watch, it's to endure, to survive, and to somehow, against all odds, get some sleep amidst the worst conditions imaginable. Now, you've probably heard all those stories of soldiers trying to sleep during battles, how their bodies were dead tired, but their minds wouldn't let them rest. Imagine that. But make it colder. Much, much colder. And it's not just the cold outside that threatens to break you, it's the cold inside too. The barracks you sleep in aren't exactly five-star accommodations. They're rough, utilitarian structures made to endure the worst the Arctic can throw at them. They might give you a roof over your head, but they don't offer much more. You can feel the cold air slipping through cracks in the walls and under the door. No matter how tightly you shut it, the chill creeps under your skin, down your spine, and settles in your bones. Every night, you wonder how much longer you can keep doing this. The problem isn't just physical, it's mental too. The soldiers around you are all in the same boat, fighting off exhaustion, the cold, and the creeping fear that the next storm could be the one that breaks them. Every day feels like it's been stretched into an eternity, and every night it's a battle to keep warm enough to sleep. But sleep, as it turns out, is vital. Without it, your body will break down, your mind will turn against you, and you'll be no good to anyone. The cold is relentless, yes, but the need for sleep is even more so. You can't ignore it. You can't power through it. Eventually your body will demand rest, and when that happens, you'll have to find a way to make it work. But how do you sleep in an environment where every breath you take feels like it could freeze your lungs? Where every part of you is constantly on edge? Every sound outside could be the next blizzard hitting, and where you're wrapped up in so many layers of clothing that you're not sure if you're actually more insulated or just stuck in a cocoon of discomfort. It seems impossible. But the soldiers who survived this environment didn't just make it work. They had to adapt, innovate, and learn some hard lessons along the way. The truth is, surviving in the Arctic isn't about overcoming the cold with sheer willpower. It's about working with it. It's about understanding how to manage your body in extreme temperatures, how to use your gear in the best way possible, and how to turn the environment from a deadly enemy into a manageable obstacle. You don't fight the cold, you make it. You're all right, at least as much as you can. The first step in surviving the Arctic nights was figuring out how to sleep at all. It sounds simple, right? You just lie down and fall asleep. But when the temperature outside is well below freezing, and inside the barracks, it's only slightly warmer, that idea becomes much more complicated. The ground you sleep on is hard, cold, and unforgiving. The bedding you're given is thin, probably old, and not much better than what you'd find in a drafty attic. Even the best sleep sack or blanket can only do so much when the air is freezing, and the cold seeps through everything like water through a leaky dam. So, how did soldiers manage to get some sleep in these conditions? The first thing they learned was that layering was everything. But not just any kind of layering. No, you had to do it strategically. Too much clothing and you couldn't move. Too little and you'd freeze. The key was to wear layers that trapped heat without making you immobile. But even with the perfect layering, you were still at the mercy of the cold. The military-issued cold weather gear was a lifeline, but it wasn't perfect. The coats, boots, and gloves were designed to keep you alive, but they weren't always practical. Some of them didn't breathe well, meaning that after you worked up a sweat, you'd find yourself drenched in moisture. And when moisture freezes, that's a whole new level of misery, but you had to make do. Layering up wasn't just about wearing everything you had. It was about knowing when to put on or take off certain pieces depending on the conditions. For example, when you were heading out to fly the planes, you'd wear more, but when you were trying to sleep, it was all about maintaining the right balance of warmth and ventilation. And the moment you took your boots off after a long day in the cold, that's when you really understood the true power of winter. The cold would hit your feet like a sledgehammer, and suddenly those thick wool socks didn't seem like enough. The constant battle to stay warm, even in the most basic tasks, like sleeping, becomes an overwhelming cycle. You layer up, try to sleep, wake up freezing, adjust your layers, and repeat. That's the reality of life in the Arctic. It's not just about fighting the cold outside, it's about learning to live with it, adapt to it, and find ways to rest while constantly aware that the environment could take you down at any moment. But this fight for warmth and sleep is only the beginning. As we move on, we'll explore the different ways soldiers adapted, the innovative solutions they came up with to manage the cold, and how they turned the Arctic's brutal environment into a challenge they could survive, not just endure. The relentless cold in the Arctic doesn't just threaten your comfort, it threatens your very survival. It's one thing to endure it for a few hours, it's another to try to sleep in it. Every soldier stationed here had to battle the cold, not just in their waking hours, but especially when they were trying to rest. But how do you sleep when the very air you breathe feels like it could freeze your lungs? The struggle begins with the most obvious piece of the puzzle, the barracks. They were often simple wooden structures, hastily built to house as many soldiers as possible, while keeping the wind from blowing through every crack. You'd think that in such a bitterly cold place, these buildings would be heavily insulated. But no, while they kept some of the wind out, they weren't much better than sleeping outside, especially when the temperature inside hovered just above freezing. It was a constant reminder that nature, no matter how much you tried to fight it, was the dominant force here. But there was a silver lining. Eventually, the soldiers learned to adapt to the conditions, using whatever materials they could find to make the spaces slightly more bearable. One trick was covering the walls with whatever insulation could be scrounged up, like old wool blankets or even cardboard, which wouldn't do much to keep the heat in, but it helped. Every little bit counted. The goal was always to trap any warmth from the space heater in the center of the room. which was probably the only source of heat. Aside from body heat and a few personal stoves, the barracks themselves became a battlefield in their own right. The temperature difference between one corner of the room and the other could be the difference between staying alive or succumbing to the cold. If you slept near the heater, it was still cold, but slightly more tolerable. If you slept at the far end of the room, near the window, forget about it. That space was a literal icebox, and you'd be lucky if you didn't wake up with your clothes frozen to the bed now. There were some soldiers who managed to keep the worst of the cold at bay through sheer ingenuity. They would hoard extra bedding sheets, blankets, even extra jackets or coats, anything they could get their hands on to create a cocoon of warmth around themselves. Layering up with every piece of clothing was a survival tactic, but it wasn't without its downsides. Too many layers, and you couldn't move, which made it even harder to get comfortable enough to sleep. Then there were the sleep sacks. These specialized bags were meant to keep soldiers warm at night, and in the Arctic, they were a godsend. But even sleep sacks, with their extra insulation, weren't perfect. They helped trap warmth, but they didn't completely eliminate the biting chill that would work its way in around the edges. Even with the best sleep sacks, soldiers had to constantly adjust their position, struggling to find a way to block the cold air that seeped into their personal bubble. But it wasn't just the cold in the barracks that made sleep a challenge. The real issue came from the cold outside, the one that crept into your body, into your bones, and made it feel like no amount of clothing could ever keep you warm enough. When you went to bed, it wasn't as simple as snuggling up under your covers and drifting off. Your mind was always racing, constantly alert to the sensation of frost gathering on your skin. And then there was the constant problem of frostbite. It wasn't just a concern when you were outside, it was a risk even when you were inside, trying to sleep. Imagine this: you're wrapped in your layers, snuggled in your sleep sack, but your toes are still cold, or your fingers, or even your nose. The frozen air would seep into the room, making even the most insulated soldiers vulnerable to the dangers of frostbite. For many, it wasn't just about finding warmth, it was about avoiding frostbite. Soldiers who could feel their extremities freezing would wake up in the middle of the night, desperately trying to rub warmth back into their limbs, sometimes even shaking uncontrollably from the cold. But frostbite wasn't just a momentary inconvenience, it was a long-term threat. If it wasn't treated immediately, it could lead to gangrene, loss of limbs, or worse. It was a constant low-grade fear that would keep many soldiers awake at night, listening to the soft crackle of frost forming on the walls, wondering if it was time to get up and try to get warm again. But it wasn't just the cold that kept you from sleep. There were the endless noises of the Arctic, the howling wind, the creaking of the barracks as they fought against the storms outside, the rustle of the snow as it piled up against the building. Each of these sounds was a reminder that, no matter how much you tried to sleep, you were never truly safe. The silence of a normal night was a luxury that soldiers in the Arctic couldn't afford. In the dead of winter, the night was alive with the harsh sounds of nature trying to break through any barrier you'd put in its way. And even when the wind wasn't howling, there was the threat of something even more chilling: the endless darkness. In the farthest reaches of the Arctic, the sun barely rises in the winter months. For weeks on end, soldiers lived in an unrelenting night, and this perpetual darkness had an impact on more than just their sleep. It affected their psyche. It was hard to tell when day started and when night began, leaving soldiers disoriented, exhausted, and more prone to the effects of sleep deprivation. In a place where the temperature never seemed to rise above freezing, and the darkness was never-ending, sleep wasn't just about shutting your eyes and letting your body recharge. It was about survival. Every night was a challenge to rest, and every morning you woke up with the hope that somehow you'd made it through another cold, unforgiving night. So, how did soldiers manage to get any sleep at all in this kind of environment? It was a mixture of ingenuity, resilience, and some incredible luck. But as we'll see, sleep was never a given, it was always something that had to be earned. Asterisk, one of the primary weapons soldiers had in the Arctic, aside from their sheer will to survive, was their clothing. The battle against the cold started long before the first drop of snow started, when they dressed in the morning. But getting the right layers on was a matter of science, trial, and error. Too little, and you were exposed to the dangers of frostbite. Too much, and you could end up sweating in a place where sweat might as well be liquid ice. The key was in layering, and not just any layering. Soldiers learned quickly that cotton, while comfortable, wasn't a friend of warmth in these extreme temperatures. Cotton traps moisture sweat, for instance, and that moisture would freeze quickly in the Arctic chill. No, wool was the material of choice. Wool retained warmth even when wet, making it the ideal fabric for both the cold and the intense humidity that came with the body's constant struggle to stay warm. The base layer, the first line of defense, was made up of long underwear, typically wool, or more modern synthetic alternatives if they were available. These kept the body's core temperature from dropping too much during the night. Then came the thicker layers, including heavy woolen sweaters, thermal trousers, and of course, the essential military-issued parka. The parka was a soldier's most trusted companion. Its heavy fabric meant to trap body heat and shield against the wind, which could slice through any less insulated garment like a knife through butter. Still, the cold didn't care much for your fancy. Every soldier learned the hard way that simply wearing more layers wasn't enough. The trick was balancing the amount of clothing with the ability to move and adapt to the ever-changing conditions. Too much heat and your body would sweat then. Once the heat was gone, it'd be as if you'd made a deal with the Arctic itself to freeze solid. So, it became a delicate art, this constant balancing act, learning exactly when to strip off a layer and when to add one back on. There were some tricks, though, that soldiers learned along the way. One method for keeping warm was sleeping in shifts. This wasn't exactly a scheduled routine, but it became a common tactic to avoid complete exhaustion. One soldier would sleep while the other kept watch, trying to keep the warmth trapped within the sleeping bags as much as possible. The rotation wasn't always formal, but it worked. Soldiers would take turns waking up in the night to stoke the fire, keep watch, or sometimes just make sure that no one was inadvertently freezing due to inadequate clothing or exposure to the cold. As much as these layers helped, the soldiers still faced a harsh reality. The battle against the cold didn't end when they reached the barracks. The cold would seep into their bones no matter what they did. And the hardest part wasn't the cold in their clothes, it was the cold that became a part of them. No matter how much you layered up, the coldness seemed to find a way to creep into your body. And once it was in, it wasn't easy to shake it off. There were some who would say that the key to surviving the cold was in what you didn't wear. Sounds odd, right? But hear me out. One theory, which some of the soldiers swore by, was that taking off a layer of clothing and resting without it for short periods of time would encourage your body to build up heat faster. You had to trick your body into adjusting, into taking back control from the Arctic. The theory was that the less you relied on the insulation of your layers, the more your body would naturally turn on its internal heating system. This, of course, wasn't something to be attempted lightly. Freezing your body too much could end badly. But in the long run, it helped build resilience against the cold. The other problem, as you might guess, wasn't just staying warm, was staying dry. Wet clothes in the Arctic weren't just uncomfortable, they were life-threatening. Every soldier had to learn to take care of his gear, even in the most basic ways. That meant hanging up wet socks and gloves to dry inside the barracks when possible. Every little bit of moisture needed to be accounted for. You couldn't afford to let any piece of clothing remain damp for long, especially when the temperature could drop faster than you could blink. But clothing alone wasn't the answer. The real secret to surviving the cold nights was in the heating. And while the barracks provided some shelter, nothing compared to the warmth of a fire. But stoking a fire in the middle of a blizzard, well, that's another matter entirely. The fire, usually placed in a central stove or heater, was often the last line of defense against the cold. These stoves had to be carefully managed to much heat, and the room became suffocating. Too little, and it might as well be a freezer. Soldiers had to monitor the stove throughout the night, ensuring that the temperature stayed steady, which was no easy feat. But it wasn't just the fire itself, it was how soldiers positioned themselves around it that made all the difference. The closer you were to the heat, the warmer you felt. The farther away, the more you risked the cold taking over. On rare occasions, soldiers would have the luxury of a proper fireplace to huddle around, but these were often in short supply. What they did have, however, was ingenuity. Some soldiers figured out ways to create makeshift heating methods, like burning logs in metal barrels or setting up personal stoves in their sleeping areas. It wasn't always effective, but it was a way of fighting back against the Arctic's fury. These little tricks, combined with proper clothing, could make a huge difference in a soldier's ability to rest, but they required constant vigilance. The worst thing, perhaps, wasn't the cold itself, it was the mental strain. Soldiers were tired. The cold wore them down mentally just as much as it did physically. Trying to sleep in an environment that constantly reminded you of its hostility was exhausting in its own right. And the sound of the wind outside. It was a constant reminder that no matter how much warmth you trapped, nature was always waiting to take it away. The Arctic was a place that would wear a person down, piece by piece, layer by layer. But for soldiers, there was no choice but to fight through it. They weren't just battling the cold, they were battling fatigue, isolation, and the deep sense that the world around them was trying to freeze them out. And yet, despite all of that, sleep was necessary. It wasn't just a luxury, it was a survival tool. Without it, the body couldn't function, the mind couldn't focus, and the soldiers couldn't keep their grip on reality. So, despite everything, despite the layers, the frostbite, and the ever-present cold, sleep had to be found, one way or another. The trick was surviving long enough to let your body rest and recuperate, so that the next day you could do it all over again. Asterisk, as the months continued to unfold. The soldiers on the Arctic air bases grew accustomed to the rhythm of life in the cold. They learned that survival wasn't just about fending off the elements. It was about finding ways to thrive, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. The daily routines that had once seemed like burdens became comforting rituals, the little things that made the endless days of cold and darkness more bearable. But the struggle wasn't over. Every day was a new challenge, and even after months of adaptation, the environment still had the power to surprise them. The Arctic wasn't forgiving, and even the most seasoned soldiers knew that one mistake, one lapse in judgment, could be the difference between life and death. One of the greatest challenges the soldiers continued to face was the physical toll. The cold took on their bodies. Even after learning to manage their clothing and adjust to the sleep patterns that allowed for the most rest, the environment was relentless. The cold seeped into their bones, and while their mental resilience had grown, their bodies still bore the scars of the harsh environment. Joint pain, numbness, and the constant weariness that came from having to constantly be on alert were part of their daily existence. But it wasn't just the physical strain that was a problem, it was the way that the constant cold affected the soldiers' energy. The Arctic, with its endless winter, didn't allow for natural rest. The constant battle against the chill meant they had to conserve what little energy they had, and sleep, as fragmented as it was, became their most precious resource. Yet, despite their best efforts, many soldiers still experienced exhaustion, their bodies and minds pushing against the limits of what they could endure. The cold didn't just steal warmth from their bodies, it also sapped their spirits. Bit by bit, that this kind of exhaustion was different from the fatigue one might feel after a long day's work or a tough battle. It was the kind of fatigue that settled into your very bones, into the cells of your body. You didn't just sleep to rest, you slept to recover, to restore yourself, to get back some semblance of strength that the environment had chipped away at. It was the kind of exhaustion that made everything harder. And in those moments, when the physical and mental strain combined, it was the soldiers' inner resolve that kept them moving forward to combat this. Soldiers became adept at small tricks that kept their energy levels up. They would make use of the few luxuries available: smoking, a warm drink, and small bursts of movement to keep their blood circulating. They'd share stories or jokes, anything to keep their minds occupied. These small distractions didn't just fill time, they provided moments of relief from the constant weight of the cold. But despite all these small adjustments, the soldiers knew that they couldn't let their guard down for even a second. One night spent in a bad position, one lapse in checking the fire or adjusting their layers, could result in serious consequences. The Arctic didn't forgive mistakes, and yet, even with all these challenges, the soldiers found moments of quiet pride in their survival. They were not just enduring, they were succeeding. They were thriving in an environment that was designed to break them. The sense of accomplishment they felt after another long day, after another long night of managing their routines, was immense. They were part of something bigger than themselves, a mission, a brotherhood, and a fight for survival in one of the most extreme environments in the world. The soldiers learned to celebrate these small victories, to find pride in what they had achieved, no matter how small it seemed. They weren't just surviving the Arctic, they were pushing back against it. Every day they managed to get out of bed, every night they made it through without freezing, was a win. And that mindset, that sense of accomplishment, kept them going even when the cold seemed unbearable. But it wasn't just the physical hardships that tested the soldiers, it was the uncertainty, the ever-present question of how long they would have to endure, how long they would remain in the freezing wilderness, loomed over them. There was no definitive end in sight, no clear timeline for when they could return home. It was a constant source of stress and anxiety. The soldiers didn't know when the war would end, or when the brutal cold would finally give way to warmer days. They lived in a world where time had no meaning, where the days stretched endlessly into one another, and the nights seemed to last forever. Yet, it was in this uncertainty that they found another source of strength. They didn't focus on the unknown future. Instead, they focused on the present moment. What could they do right now to make the next few hours bearable? How could they support their fellow soldiers through the cold, through the isolation? And in those moments, they found something even more powerful than the routines, more powerful than the fire or the layers of clothing. They found purpose. Purpose wasn't about the end game, it was about the here and now. It was about the small actions they took each day, the way they banded together to endure the cold and keep their spirits up. It was about making the best of the present, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but taking each day as it came. This was the mindset that allowed them to survive. They weren't just fighting against the cold, they were fighting for each other. And that, more than anything, gave them the strength to keep moving forward. The sense of camaraderie and the shared purpose became the backbone of their survival. They learned that they could rely on each other, even in the harshest of circumstances. Whether it was pulling together to help one soldier who had fallen behind, or simply sitting in silence together, sharing the weight of the cold, they found comfort in their unity. The bonds they formed became as important as any piece of gear or clothing they had. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the soldiers who had once been strangers found themselves tied together by more than just circumstance, were bound by their shared experience. They had survived the Arctic together, and that was something no amount of cold could take away. Through all the freezing nights, the exhaustion, the isolation, and the never-ending darkness, the soldiers discovered something extraordinary. They had not only endured the cold, they had come to understand it. They had learned to work with it, to live with it, and to rise above it. They had learned that survival wasn't just about staying warm, it was about finding strength in the face of adversity, and in each other. In the end, that was what the Arctic taught them. Resilience wasn't about conquering the cold. It was about conquering the fear, the doubt, and the isolation that the cold brought. It was about finding warmth where there was none, finding hope where there seemed to be only despair, and finding the strength to keep going when every part of you wanted to stop. And that was the greatest victory of all. Surviving the Arctic wasn't just about the ability to keep warm, to find shelter, or even to endure the isolation. It was about persistence. It was about knowing that no matter how hard the night, no matter how intense the cold, there was always another day to face, another challenge to overcome. For the soldiers stationed in these frozen outposts, survival became an act of quiet defiance, not just against the elements, but against the mental exhaustion that came with living in such an unforgiving environment. But how did these soldiers continue to fight on, especially when the environment seemed to sap every ounce of energy, focus, and optimism? The truth lies in the subtle ways they adapted to the harshness of their surroundings, not just physically, but psychologically. As we've seen, it wasn't just about finding ways to sleep or stay warm. It was about finding purpose, no matter how small the task, and using it to keep moving forward. One of the most powerful tools these soldiers had at their disposal was the sense of camaraderie they built with each other. It's easy to think that in such extreme conditions, each soldier would be an island, isolated and alone, focused solely on survival. But in truth, the soldiers relied on each other more than anything else. The bonds they forged were a critical part of their survival. They were a team in the truest sense of the word, where each person's strength became the group's strength. Camaraderie was especially important during the long, endless nights. There, in the warmth of the barracks, or around a small stove, soldiers could exchange stories, laugh, and share whatever scraps of normalcy they could find. These small moments of connection became lifelines, essential to maintaining their mental health. It wasn't just the camaraderie, though it was the sense that they were all in it together, that no one was going to give up, no matter how hard the cold got. That shared determination fueled their resilience. And then there were the moments of unexpected joy. Soldiers found ways to create light in the darkest corners of their lives. They would play games with whatever they could find: cards, dice, even makeshift board games, using whatever materials they had available. These games, while simple, provided an emotional escape, even if just for a short while. It wasn't about winning. It was about forgetting the cold for a moment, laughing together, and reminding themselves that despite everything, life was still worth living. But even in these moments of lightness, the reality of the environment was never far behind. There was always the persistent reminder of how cold it could get, how dangerous it was to slip into unconsciousness for too long, how frostbite could quickly turn into something worse if not tended to. Every small injury, every twinge of discomfort, became a potential life or death situation. Soldiers were always conscious of the fact that while they could create warmth in their camaraderie and small routines, the cold could strike at any moment and put an end to it all. The risk of frostbite became a constant fear, especially in the dead of night when soldiers were wrapped in layers of clothing. But even then, the cold crept in. Soldiers learned to be hyper-aware of their bodies, the tingle in their fingers, the numbness in their toes, the feeling of pins and needles in their limbs. These sensations were their warning signs, telling them to shift positions or readjust their clothing before frostbite set in. But even with this heightened awareness, the threat never fully went away. It was a relentless adversary, always lingering in the background, always ready to take advantage of the smallest lapse in attention. But as they adapted to the environment, soldiers also grew more attuned to the rhythms of the cold. They learned how to recognize the subtle signs of exhaustion, of frostbite, of impending hypothermia, and they learned to manage it. They developed systems to monitor each other, to keep an eye out for the signs that someone was slipping too far into the cold. This was another form of survival, the knowledge that they weren't alone, that they had each other to rely on. Sleep, in this context, was a delicate balancing act. Soldiers knew they couldn't afford to sleep too long or too deeply, for fear of waking up too late, with frostbite creeping in. But they also knew that rest was critical to maintaining their strength. It wasn't just about physical sleep, it was about finding the mental clarity to keep moving forward. And so, soldiers would sleep in shifts, waking up every few hours, to check on each other, adjust the fire, and make sure no one was freezing. These small, frequent check-ins were the difference between survival and failure. They ensured that, even in the coldest nights, no soldier would face the brutal temperature alone. As the months wore on, the soldiers developed a new understanding of sleep itself. It was no longer a luxury or a mere necessity that became a strategy. They learned how to maximize the rest they could get, how to fall asleep quickly and deeply enough to recharge, but always with one ear attuned to the sounds of the Arctic. They learned to sleep in fragmented bursts, sometimes waking up after only a few hours to shift, adjust, and check the fire. Their sleep cycles weren't normal, but they became part of their rhythm that allowed them to survive. But even as they adjusted to these patterns, the toll of the Arctic was undeniable. The isolation, the cold, and the constant vigilance wore on them. Some soldiers experienced a sense of disconnection from reality, psychological dissonance brought on by the never-ending night. The Arctic had a way of distorting perceptions, of blurring the line between reality and sleep, between the conscious and the subconscious. The days lost their meaning, and the nights felt like an endless loop, one indistinguishable from the next. Yet, for all the psychological strain, There were moments when the soldiers would look out across the frozen landscape and feel something else, a strange sense of awe. The Arctic, despite its brutal harshness, had its own kind of beauty. The endless stretches of white snow, the jagged ice peaks, and the eerie stillness of the landscape all combined to create a hauntingly beautiful, albeit dangerous, environment. And in those moments, when the cold wasn't quite so overwhelming, the soldiers would take a breath, stand tall, and appreciate the vastness of the world they had to navigate. They knew, of course, that the cold would always be there, lurking, waiting. But they also knew that they had become something more because of it. They had become masters of survival, resilient in the face of challenges that would break many. And through it all, through the long nights, the cold mornings, and the endless days of isolation, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that survival wasn't just about the cold. It was about the strength within, the will to keep going, even when everything else seemed to be working against you. As we continue to look at these soldiers' stories, we see that their strength came not just from their ability to adapt to the cold, but from the relationships they built and the resilience they cultivated within themselves. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. And in the end, that was what made them more than just survivors. They became true masters of endurance, of patience, and of the human spirit. Asterisk, as we've seen, surviving in the Arctic wasn't just about enduring the freezing cold. It was about learning how to outsmart it. And when it came to sleep, it was about figuring out how to make the environment work for you, even when everything seemed stacked against you. But there was another battle going on that many soldiers had to face, one that went beyond the physical cold, the mental toll of constant exposure to the elements. It's easy to underestimate the effect that cold has on the mind. But for soldiers in the Arctic, it was a daily struggle, not just to keep warm, but to maintain their sanity. In a place where the sun barely made an appearance for weeks, where the days blurred into an endless night, the fight wasn't just to stay warm, it was to stay alert, to stay grounded, and to keep your mind from wandering too far into the dark, places that could break you. Sleep, as it turned out, was more than just a physiological necessity. It was a mental one too. The constant cold made it difficult to rest, but even when soldiers managed to drift off, their sleep was never truly restful. The cold would creep in, no matter how many layers of blankets or sleeping bags they used. It was always there, waiting to steal away their warmth and their peace of mind. And when soldiers were woken in the middle of the night by a gust of icy wind or the sudden realization that their limbs had started to freeze, it would break the fragile sleep cycle they had worked so hard to build. But sleep wasn't just about physical recovery, it was a lifeline for the mind. Without it, soldiers couldn't function properly. Fatigue, both physical and mental, was a constant companion in these harsh conditions. The exhaustion from being unable to sleep in such a cold environment, compounded with the isolation and the fear of not making it through another night without freezing. Sleep, therefore, became a beacon of hope, a moment of respite that allowed the soldiers to regroup, recharge, and face another grueling day. However, getting the proper rest wasn't just about adjusting to the physical cold. It was about coping with the psychological weight of being cut off from the world. When you're in a remote Arctic base, the isolation can feel suffocating. It's not just the endless snow and wind, it's the overwhelming quiet, the isolation from friends and family, the feeling that you're cut off from everything familiar. There's no sunlight to mark the passage of time, no sense of day or night, just an endless stretch of frozen darkness. This lack of natural cues about time can leave you disoriented, tired, and mentally exhausted. making it even harder to sleep. It's no surprise that many soldiers reported feeling disoriented or confused during the long Arctic nights. The dark days, if you could even call them days, seemed to blend together into one long, cold stretch of time. Without the natural rhythm of light and dark to guide their schedules, soldiers often had no idea when to wake up, when to eat, or when to sleep. Their bodies began to rebel against this unnatural cycle, struggling to adjust to a routine that didn't follow the typical pattern of day and night sleep. Deprivation wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a serious threat to the soldier's effectiveness and mental health. When your mind is deprived of rest, your ability to make decisions, to stay alert, and even to control your emotions is severely compromised. Soldiers who went without sleep for extended periods were at greater risk of developing psychological issues like anxiety, depression, and, in some extreme cases, paranoia. And when you're living in conditions where every minute of every day feels like a struggle against the elements, the last thing you want is your mind betraying you too. But as difficult as it was, soldiers learned how to adapt to this psychological stress. They developed coping mechanisms to deal with the isolation and the constant cold. One of the most important strategies was the establishment of routines. Soldiers knew that without a routine, everything could quickly spiral out of control. The routine wasn't just about setting a schedule, it was about creating a sense of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic and unpredictable environment. Meals were a critical part of this routine. The act of eating, sitting together in the warmth of the barracks, and sharing stories helped provide a sense of connection and community. It was a brief respite from the constant chill, a chance to remind themselves that they weren't completely alone, even if the world outside seemed to have been swallowed by the snow. These moments of togetherness helped soldiers maintain their mental health, giving them something to hold on to in the face of overwhelming adversity. But routines weren't just about meals. They also included other small activities that helped soldiers maintain a sense of structure. These could include exercises, reading, or even writing letters, anything that could provide a distraction from the cold and the isolation. Some soldiers would engage in games, telling stories, or playing cards to pass the time, trying to create a sense of normalcy, even if it was fleeting. Another crucial coping mechanism was the camaraderie among soldiers. When you're in a situation where everything around you feels hostile, the bond between comrades becomes a lifeline. These relationships helped soldiers through the worst of the cold nights, as they could share warmth not just physically, but emotionally. Soldiers who had been through the worst together could comfort one another, keeping each other going when it seemed like there was no way to make it through another night. But even with these coping mechanisms, there were nights when the cold felt insurmountable. The mental strain was so great that sleep became a far-off dream, one that seemed almost unreachable. Yet, despite the mental and physical tolls, soldiers still managed to survive. They learned to push through the exhaustion, to make do with what little they had, and to rest as best they could in the most difficult conditions. In the end, surviving the Arctic cold wasn't just about the gear or the layers of clothing, it was about mental toughness. The soldiers who managed to endure these conditions were the ones who learned to deal with the isolation, the cold, and the psychological stress that came with being so far from home, all while never losing sight of the necessity of sleep. Without rest, without moments of peace amidst the chaos, it would have been impossible to keep fighting the cold and the elements. And though the nights in the Arctic were long, cold, and sometimes terrifying, soldiers learned to find warmth in each other, in their routines, and in the hope that they would make it through another day. This endurance wasn't just physical, was the product of a deep, unwavering will to survive against the odds. And as we'll see next, survival in the Arctic wasn't just about getting through the night. It was about learning how to thrive, even when the world seemed set on freezing you out. Asterisk, as we move further into the heart of survival in the Arctic, it's impossible to ignore one of the most crucial aspects of life on these bases, the role of fire. In an environment where the temperature could plummet to dangerously low levels, in a matter of minutes, fire wasn't just a comfort, it was a necessity. Without it, survival would have been nearly impossible. But managing fire in such extreme conditions was no easy feat. It wasn't as simple as striking a match and lighting a few logs. The Arctic environment constantly challenged every effort. To stay warm and fire something that most people take for granted became a delicate and complicated tool to control. The fires that burned in the barracks and around the base were for many soldiers the only line of defense between life and death. Soldiers stationed in these frigid conditions had to be strategic with their use of fire. You couldn't simply build a roaring bonfire and expect it to last. The wind was relentless, and the fuel was often scarce. The idea was to make the most of the fire without wasting precious resources. This meant carefully choosing what fuel to burn and when to stoke the fire. There were no idle flames in these camps. Every ember had to count. Inside the barracks, a central stove was typically the primary source of heat. These stoves were built to be durable, but even the best models struggled to keep up with the sheer cold. A stove might have been able to warm one corner of the room, but it was never enough to heat the entire barracks. Soldiers learned to cluster together near the stoves, hoping that the warmth would spread enough to offer some relief. But even with the stove working at full blast, the temperature near the windows and doors would still be unbearable. This meant that soldiers had to adapt again, bundling up in layers of clothing just to survive the nights. The biggest challenge, though, wasn't necessarily keeping warm inside. It was the act of trying to keep fires going outside. Most of the soldiers' duties took place outdoors, and during the long shifts on the tarmac while the planes were being readied for action, there was no place to escape the cold. Fire was still needed to keep the men alive during these hours of exposure. That's where the improvisation came into play. Small, portable stoves were used during outdoor shifts, and these became an essential piece of equipment. Soldiers would huddle around them, trying to soak in as much heat as possible, though there was always the fear that the wind might knock them over, or that the fuel might run out too quickly. But even these small stoves weren't foolproof. Sometimes they were not enough to ward off the freezing temperatures. Soldiers would often find themselves wrapped in blankets, shivering while they worked, struggling to balance the need to stay warm with the urgency of the mission. There were also fires set up to help melt the snow for drinking water. The cold environment made it impossible to drink the fresh water straight from the taps. It would freeze instantly. So soldiers would melt snow using whatever method they could, sometimes relying on improvised fires that, while helpful, were always risky. The act of melting snow became another small routine that helped soldiers get through the day and night. But even fire had its limitations. There were many nights when the fire would die down and soldiers would have no choice but to huddle together in the cold, trying to sleep while the wind howled outside. And when firewood was in short supply, which was often the case, soldiers had to learn how to make every piece of fuel last as long as possible. Sometimes they would burn their own gear if it became necessary, anything to keep the fire alive, if only for a few more hours. The mental strain of being so close to fire, yet still feeling the cold, was perhaps the most taxing. It was a constant reminder that the Arctic was a place that could turn on you in an instant, even when you thought you had everything in control. There was always something that could go wrong, whether it was the fire going out, the stove breaking, or a sudden storm sweeping in to ruin your plans. And yet, there was something oddly comforting about the fire. It wasn't just warmth, it was a small piece of civilization in an otherwise savage land. Fire represented life. It was the one thing that made the unbearable conditions slightly more tolerable. Soldiers would gather around the stove, sharing stories, jokes, and the occasional laugh, trying to remember what it felt like to be warm, to be comfortable. The fire became a symbol of hope, a constant in a world full of uncertainty. But even with the fire, even with the gear and the routines, the mental toll of life in the Arctic was unrelenting. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a part of the soldiers' everyday existence, one they had to constantly adapt to. Sleep was elusive. The fire couldn't always be stoked. The dark days stretched on forever. And yet, somehow, the soldiers managed to keep going. It wasn't just the physical challenges they faced, but the psychological weight of it all. It was the feeling of being far from home, of being cut off from everything they knew. The soldiers learned to take comfort in the little things, the fire, the camaraderie, the brief moments of rest. They became experts in surviving, not just physically, but emotionally. They found ways to manage the isolation and the monotony. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, but in the harshest, most unforgiving environment on Earth, the soldiers learned what it meant to survive on, to sleep as best they could in the harshest of conditions. As the cold bore down on these Arctic outposts, it wasn't just the physical conditions that soldiers had to contend with. The Arctic environment was relentless, not only in its biting chill, but also in its psychological strain. And as the nights grew longer and darker, the mental toll began to show. Sleep, though necessary for physical survival, also became a challenge for the soldiers' minds. The first noticeable effect of prolonged exposure to the darkness and cold was disorientation. Without the sun as a guide, soldiers lost their sense of time. A day might blur into a week, and soon the weeks into months. This disorientation took its toll, making it harder for soldiers to maintain focus. The constant night, the never-ending snow, and the absence of natural cycles wore them down. It was easy to forget if it was day or night, and some soldiers even reported a kind of mental fog. This constant haze would often lead to fatigue that wasn't just physical, but cognitive as well. Decisions became harder to make, and simple tasks felt monumental. This was compounded by the mental isolation of the Arctic. The environment itself was a silent adversary. Its bleakness and quiet intensity could erode a soldier's morale over time. There were no distractions here, no sounds of bustling cities, or even animals to break the endless quiet. In the midst of the never-ending cold, soldiers found themselves not only battling the elements, but also their own sense of loneliness and confinement. Social interactions, which might otherwise help alleviate some of the stress, often became strained. With little to do in the long hours of darkness, some soldiers found themselves growing irritable, quick to snap at each other over the smallest things. This isolation wasn't just a feeling, it was a real psychological weight that affected everything from sleep patterns to emotional health. When you're constantly surrounded by nothing but snow, ice, and the flickering warmth of a fire that's always on the verge of going out, your mind starts to play tricks on you. Some soldiers reported hallucinations, others found themselves unable to fall asleep even when exhaustion was overwhelming. The mental strain was as dangerous as the cold itself. This was where the concept of mental resilience truly came into play. In these extreme conditions, soldiers had to rely on their inner strength, a determination to endure that was as necessary as their winter gear. But even the most resilient soldiers could only take so much. When sleep became elusive, when the body had been pushed too far, when the isolation reached a peak, it was difficult to keep going. The longing for warmth, for human connection, and for the light of day became consuming. But then, like clockwork, soldiers began to find small ways to adapt, ways to keep their minds occupied, to hold on to that flickering flame of hope. Some soldiers began keeping journals, not just to document the horrors of their situation, but to stay connected with their humanity. Writing became a tool of expression, a way of creating some order in a world that felt entirely out of control. Others turned to small comforts, like reading books or writing letters home, even though they knew those letters might never be received. But the most important element that kept the soldiers going was camaraderie. As isolated as they were, they still had each other. There were few luxuries in the Arctic outposts, but the companionship of fellow soldiers was irreplaceable. Sharing stories, laughing over a cup of rationed coffee, or even just sitting quietly together by the stove, these small moments of human connection became lifelines. The bonds formed between soldiers were unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared hardship. The relationships they built in those frozen barracks were a source of strength, reminding them that they weren't alone in the struggle. For those who managed to sleep despite the overwhelming conditions, the rest wasn't always peaceful. It was a battle in itself to maintain sleep cycles, especially when disturbed by the ever-present threat of frostbite. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, understanding that it was essential to stay alert while others rested. The cold, though, never took a break. Even when soldiers did manage to fall asleep, it was often a fitful, restless slumber, interrupted by the numbing chill that would creep in from the corners of the room. In the worst cases, soldiers who slept too long in one position would wake up with limbs that had gone numb. The sensation of pins and needles became a dreaded feeling, a reminder that frostbite could be just one bad decision away. And even when you did wake up, the cold was never far behind. It was a constant reminder that no matter how much you layered up, no matter how many tricks you employed, the Arctic was still the one in charge. But soldiers found ways to survive, to cope, and most importantly, to sleep. The resilience to push through another day, to make it through another long night, wasn't just physical, it was mental. Soldiers began to understand that they needed to nurture their minds just as much as their bodies, learning how to stay emotionally strong and finding ways to adapt became just as crucial to their survival as having the right clothing or fire. Through ingenuity, camaraderie, and sheer willpower, the men stationed at Arctic air bases found ways to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against them. They learned that in the harshest of environments, survival wasn't just about battling the cold, it was about maintaining hope and finding warmth, both physically and mentally, in the most desolate of places. And while the stories of their survival remain a testament to their strength, it also highlights the importance of sleep in extreme conditions. The cold, the isolation, and the psychological toll of constant exposure to the elements would have broken many. But the soldiers who thrived in the Arctic understood that sleep wasn't just a necessity, was a lifeline, a moment of peace. In a world that felt like it was constantly trying to freeze them out. As we continue, we'll dive deeper into the strategies soldiers developed for sleep and rest, and how these tactics allowed them to endure one of the harshest environments known to man. From clever sleep routines to the small victories in managing their mental health. These soldiers didn't just survive the Arctic, they learned to thrive in it, one restless night at a time. While managing the physical and psychological challenges of sleeping in the Arctic was crucial for the soldiers. It was also about the small details that helped make the impossible more bearable. As we've explored, the cold was relentless, but the soldiers' survival in these frozen outposts depended on their ability to adapt to the elements and make the best of the situation. But one of the most critical elements that contributed to their ability to sleep and stay sane was routine. In the Arctic, where everything around you was cold, dark, and constant, maintaining a routine provided a sense of order and control that the soldiers desperately needed. Routine might seem like a small thing, but in an environment where nothing else could be relied upon, it became a cornerstone of survival. For soldiers on the Arctic air bases, a sense of normalcy was essential. Whether it was the exact time they would wake up, the rituals around meals, or the little personal habits they maintained, routines became a psychological anchor in a place that was, otherwise, a constant battle. The days were long, the nights even longer, and the routine was a structure that allowed soldiers to continue to function. A typical day started with the coldest of mornings. Soldiers would wake up, often long before the sun even considered rising. The dark, frozen world outside mirrored the darkness in their minds as they dragged themselves from their makeshift sleeping bags. The cold had a way of greeting you first thing in the morning, nipping at your skin before you even had a chance to get moving. But no matter how awful the night had been, they couldn't afford to sleep the day away. The daily routine had to be maintained. Planes needed to be prepared for flight, communications needed to be checked, and supplies had to be monitored. Even if the Arctic air sapped every ounce of energy, work still had to be done. That sense of duty, of having a purpose, was another crucial aspect of maintaining mental strength. Soldiers needed to feel like their work mattered, that their presence was essential to the larger mission. This wasn't just about keeping busy for the sake of distraction. These were critical tasks that required every ounce of focus and skill they could muster. But what about the sleep part? How could soldiers balance all of these responsibilities while still getting some much-needed rest? The truth is, they didn't always get enough sleep, and that was something they had to learn to live with. However, the routines around sleep were essential in maximizing whatever rest they could get. It was common for soldiers to sleep in shifts. The need to remain alert, especially when you were working in such a hostile environment, meant that not everyone could afford to sleep at once. They had to take turns watching the barracks, tending to fires, and making sure nothing went wrong. The shifts helped maintain a balance between staying warm and safe while also catching enough sleep to stay functional. But even with the support of their comrades and the structure of routines, the cold was always there, always threatening. And sometimes, despite all the strategies, despite all the effort to sleep and keep warm, the cold would win. It would creep in when soldiers least expected it. But those were the nights when their inner strength truly kicked in. They had already overcome so much. And even when it felt impossible, they knew that the next day would come. The sun might be a distant dream, but the day would come, and with it, the chance to try again. It was this constant cycle of adaptation, perseverance, and support that helped soldiers make it through the Arctic nights. They learned not just to survive, but to find ways to thrive in an environment that sought to break them. They found warmth not just in the fire, but in each other, and in those moments of sleep. No matter how short or fragmented, they found the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, and to keep surviving. In the end, the Arctic did not break them. It may have been cold, it may have been isolating, but it was here that soldiers forged an unshakable resilience. They adapted to the cold, yes, but they also learned to thrive in the face of it. They did not just survive the Arctic, they conquered it, one night of interrupted sleep at a time. Asterisk, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, something remarkable happened. The soldiers, once driven by the basic urge to survive, began to adapt to the Arctic environment in ways they hadn't thought possible. What was once an inhospitable, frozen wasteland gradually became something they learned to endure, even master. It wasn't about beating the cold, it was about learning how to live with it. And in many ways, the constant struggle against the Arctic became as much a part of the soldiers' identities as their military duties. But even as they became more proficient in surviving the cold, the threat of exhaustion and sleep deprivation remained constant. No matter how well they adjusted to their routines, how many layers they piled on, or how well they managed the fires, sleep still remained an elusive prize. As we've seen, soldiers had to work with their environment, adapting their sleep patterns, their mental resilience, and their physical strength to stay functional in such harsh conditions. The question becomes, how did they manage to stay sharp, to keep their edge, when the night seemed endless, when the fire seemed too small, and when their bodies were constantly fighting off exhaustion and the bitter chill? The answer lies in one word: adaptation. The soldiers understood that in the Arctic, nothing was permanent. The cold wasn't going to go away. The darkness wasn't going to lift anytime soon, and the isolation wasn't going anywhere. But they learned how to adapt to these challenges, how to make the best of what they had. One of the most important lessons they learned was that despite the freezing temperatures, despite the lack of sunlight, they needed to embrace the routine. A schedule wasn't just helpful, it was essential. The rhythm of daily life, of knowing exactly when you'd eat, when you'd work, and when you could sleep, became the glue that held everything together. And while the conditions might have made it difficult to maintain perfect sleep cycles, soldiers did their best to follow a consistent schedule. But beyond just the physical aspects of adaptation, there was also an emotional and psychological shift that took place over time. What had once been a fight against the cold became a kind of resilience-building exercise. Soldiers stopped seeing the Arctic as an enemy to be defeated and started viewing it as an obstacle to be worked with. This shift in mentality was vital. In keeping morale high and spirits intact, the cold no longer had the same psychological impact. Where once it might have been paralyzing, it became a challenge to overcome, a test of endurance. As soldiers got better at surviving, they also grew stronger mentally, learning to embrace the harshness rather than resist it. It wasn't just about staying warm anymore, it was about staying strong, about finding ways to thrive under these extreme conditions. The importance of small comforts also became more pronounced. Soldiers began to find solace in the simplest of things: sitting by the fire, listening to music, sharing a joke with a fellow soldier. It was these moments of connection, of shared humanity, that helped to soften the edges of the cold. The camaraderie that had begun as a survival tactic became a lifeline. Soldiers leaned on each other, physically and emotionally, helping to maintain their collective strength. But even as they became more accustomed to the cold, there were always new challenges to face. As the years went on, the weather didn't get any easier. The Arctic was an environment that had a way of testing its inhabitants at every turn. And while the soldiers had learned to live with the cold, it still had the power to humble them. No matter how many layers they wore, how many fire tricks they had up their sleeves, or how well they managed their routines, there were always moments when the cold would remind them just how vulnerable they were. Still, the soldiers persevered, even when their bodies felt like they couldn't take any more. Even when the cold seemed unbearable, they kept going. They had learned that surviving the Arctic wasn't just about resisting it, was about enduring. It was about finding small victories in the middle of adversity. It was about leaning into the discomfort, accepting it as part of their reality, and using it to fuel their strength. In the end, the key to surviving in the Arctic wasn't just about how well you could manage the cold, it was about how well you could manage yourself in the cold. The soldiers didn't just learn how to sleep in freezing conditions, they learned how to live in them. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson they took away from the experience. So, as we reflect on the long, hard winters of the Arctic, let's remember that survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mental toughness, adaptability, and the ability to find moments of peace and connection in the most trying of circumstances. The soldiers who endured these conditions didn't just survive, they thrived. They built a resilience that carried them through the worst of it, and in the process, they taught us all what it truly means to endure. The Arctic, with all its cold and isolation, was a place where the human spirit could either wither or rise. And the soldiers who faced it, who battled the cold night after cold night, didn't just fight to survive, they fought to stay human. They fought to keep their sanity, their sense of purpose, and their sense of self intact. And through it all, they found a way to sleep, to rest, and to continue the fight. Their survival wasn't just a testament to their physical toughness. It was a reminder of the power of the human spirit to adapt, to endure, and to find strength in the darkest of places and in the harshest of environments. Sleep was a small victory. It wasn't just a need, it was a reminder that, even in the worst of conditions, we can still find peace. Asterisk, with each passing day, the soldiers stationed at the Arctic air bases grew increasingly adept at surviving in this frozen wilderness. The combination of routine, camaraderie, mental resilience, and clever adaptations had carried them through months of unimaginable hardships. Yet, despite the numerous strategies they had developed, there was always the looming presence of the cold, a constant companion that never truly relented. In the Arctic, sleep wasn't just about resting the body, it was about resetting the mind to the mental toll of the cold. The isolation and the endless darkness was as much a threat to survival as the physical danger. While the physical adaptations soldiers had made to the cold were impressive, the mental strategies they developed were just as vital. They learned to embrace the discomfort and the quiet. They found ways to fill the void left by the absence of daylight, using small rituals to bring some normalcy to their days. Asterisk, these rituals were simple, yet powerful. Meals were one of the most crucial anchors in the soldiers' daily routines. Eating together in the dim light of the barracks wasn't just about nourishment. It was a small act of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic world. The food wasn't gourmet-rationed, frozen, and often unappetizing, but it was a source of energy. And, more importantly, a reminder that life was still going on outside the freezing landscape. There was a kind of comfort in these moments of routine, a shared experience that connected soldiers. Despite the physical and emotional isolation they faced, asterisk, the act of sitting down for a meal with fellow soldiers became more than just eating it, became a form of mental survival. They'd laugh, share stories, and even joke about how cold it was. This camaraderie, this shared experience, was what helped them make it through the longest and coldest nights. It was the moments of laughter, even in the face of such hardship, that reminded them they were human. They weren't just soldiers. They were people trying to find meaning and comfort in the bleakest of circumstances. But beyond these small routines, there was also the need for mental escape. The soldiers couldn't survive on routine alone. They needed to disconnect from the endless grind of their environment. It wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about surviving the mental strain of it. To that end, many soldiers took solace in small luxuries, like writing letters home or reading books, anything that allowed them to escape their present reality, even for just a moment. The importance of these small escapes cannot be overstated. While the physical cold was always a threat, the mental cold, loneliness, isolation, and the crushing weight of the environment was arguably the harder battle. Soldiers needed a way to break free from the monotony, to remind themselves that they were still capable of experiencing joy, warmth, and human connection. The letters they wrote, the books they read, and even the jokes they shared all provided a mental break, a mental warmth that was just as essential as the physical warmth they sought from the fire. And in the rare moments when soldiers were able to sleep through the night, it was like a small victory. The cold wasn't as constant as it seemed. There were times when the fire, the layers, the camaraderie, and the routines would come together to create a perfect storm of warmth, enough warmth for a soldier to slip into deep, uninterrupted sleep. These moments of rest became sacred, treasured. More than anything else, they were brief, fleeting, but for those few hours, the world outside seemed to pause, and the Arctic air was kept at bay. However, even during these rare moments of rest, the cold was never entirely absent. The soldiers would wake in the morning, chilled to the bone, but there was still a sense of accomplishment. They had survived another night. Despite everything, the biting wind, the unrelenting snow, the weight of isolation, they had made it. Through that was the essence of life in the Arctic: resilience. They didn't have to win the battle against the cold every time, but they did have to keep showing up. And every time they woke up in the morning, still alive, still capable of fighting on, was a small triumph in itself. As the months passed and the soldiers grew more accustomed to the harsh conditions, they developed an unspoken understanding with the environment. The Arctic didn't give them any mercy, but they had learned to coexist with it. There was no escaping the cold, no way to make the darkness disappear, but there was strength in knowing how to live with it, in knowing how to endure. The soldiers found ways to make the cold, the isolation, and the darkness part of their reality, rather than something to fight against. They learned that they couldn't control the weather, but they could control their reactions to it. In many ways, the Arctic became a test of willpower. How far could they push themselves? How long could they hold on? And with each day that passed, with each night that they survived, they proved that the human spirit was stronger than the most brutal of environments. This ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in such a harsh, unforgiving place became the defining feature of life in the Arctic. It wasn't about conquering the environment, it was about learning how to coexist with it. The soldiers learned that the cold didn't have to break them. It could become something they learned to live with, something they could endure, something that made them stronger in the end. Sleep, then, wasn't just about finding comfort, it was about finding the strength to face another day. It was about understanding that even in the coldest, most isolating of environments, there was always the possibility of survival. There was always the possibility of warmth, if only for a fleeting moment. The soldiers in the Arctic didn't just survive, they thrived. And through their resilience, their camaraderie, and their unwavering strength, they proved that no amount of cold could ever freeze their spirit. Asterisk, in the Arctic, survival wasn't just about enduring the extreme cold, the isolation, or even the Endless Nights It was about finding ways to keep your mind in check when everything around you seemed to push you to the brink of collapse. The cold was an enemy that couldn't be defeated with brute strength alone. It required patience, creativity, and a certain level of mental toughness that few environments demanded in such abundance. As soldiers continued to live in the harshest of conditions, they came to understand that the cold wasn't the only force they had to fight. While physical endurance was essential, it was mental fortitude that made the real difference between surviving and succumbing. The isolation, the constant gray skies, the lack of sunlight, all of it could eat away at a soldier's spirit if they weren't careful. It's easy to think of soldiers as being hardened, unmoved by the hardships of war. But in the Arctic, that perception quickly shatters. Soldiers were, after all, human. The constant darkness played tricks on their minds. The unending cold wore them down physically. They began to lose track of time, and the days and nights blurred together in an unending cycle of cold, work, and brief moments of rest. There was something almost surreal about how the Arctic manipulated their perceptions of reality. They weren't just stuck in a freezing environment, they were trapped in their own minds, unable to truly escape the darkness. They couldn't step outside for a walk to clear their heads or sit by a warm fireplace with family. They couldn't escape the psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. One of the most striking effects of the isolation was how it skewed the sense of time. In a place where daylight was either non-existent or barely a distant memory, soldiers lost the ability to measure time in the way they once did. The hours bled into one another, and before they knew it, entire weeks had passed with little more than a few brief memories of the outside world. This disorientation was a kind of mental fog that settled in, making the simplest of tasks feel like monumental efforts. What seemed like a simple day's work could easily turn into a grueling test of endurance when the mind couldn't anchor itself in time. And it wasn't just about the cold. It was the constant vigilance that it demanded. Unlike other theaters of war, where danger came in explosive bursts, the Arctic threat was persistent, relentless. The soldiers couldn't relax their guard, even for a moment. A slip in concentration could lead to frostbite. A missed adjustment in their layers could cost them hours of precious warmth. And a failure to stoke the fire properly might mean a dangerous drop in temperature overnight. The very act of sleeping, which for most people was a comforting end to the day, became a fraught experience of constant awareness. But there was a strange kind of calm that came from this hyper-awareness. It was as though the soldiers were learning to dance with the cold. It was always there, always nipping at their heels, but they learned to accept it, to move with it rather than against it. And in those moments, when they could fully tune in to the rhythm of the environment, they found a kind of peace. It wasn't the peace of a warm bed or the comfort of a sunny afternoon, but a quiet acceptance of the circumstances, a determination to make the best of what they had in many ways. This mental shift was what allowed soldiers to survive. Their ability to adapt, to find small joys in the routine, and to support one another emotionally became the foundation of their endurance. When soldiers were struggling with their mental health, it wasn't the barracks or the cold that helped them, it was the people around them. The camaraderie was not just about physical survival, it was the glue that held them together when the mind wanted to break. It was shared moments of laughter, the exchange of letters, the act of simply sitting together and watching the storm rage outside. Yet, there were still moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The soldiers knew the toll the environment was taking on them, but they also understood that they couldn't show weakness, not in a place like this. To show weakness was to risk the group's survival. So, they kept pushing, kept adapting, kept fighting. There was a strange pride that came from surviving the day, from enduring another long night in the cold. And with every passing day, they learned a little more about themselves and their resilience. As the days turned into months, these small victories became everything. Every time they woke up, every time they managed to stay warm for a few more hours, every time they laughed in the face of exhaustion, it was a win. And while the cold never fully loosened its grip, soldiers had become experts at surviving in the Arctic. They had found ways to live with the cold, to make it their own, and in doing so, they had created a kind of mental fortress. The cold could freeze their bodies, but it could never freeze their spirits. In those final, dark weeks, when the war was drawing to a close, and the end of their time in the Arctic was finally in sight, the soldiers began to reflect on what they had accomplished. What had started as an impossible battle against the environment had become a lesson in human perseverance, adaptability, and camaraderie. They had not just survived the cold, they had transformed it into a part of their identity. They had learned to navigate the cold with grace, resilience, and an unbreakable bond between them. It was an extraordinary testament to the human will to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning even in the harshest of circumstances. These soldiers didn't just endure the Arctic, they conquered it, not through sheer force, but through mental strength, unity, and an unwavering belief that they could withstand anything the environment threw at them. And in the end, it was their ability to sleep in the cold, to rest in the face of constant adversity, that marked the final victory. They had learned that rest wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about emotional survival. And with that, they had truly conquered the Arctic. As the winter slowly began to thaw and the end of their deployment loomed on the horizon, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere at the Arctic outposts. The soldiers who had endured the relentless cold for so long now found themselves facing a new kind of challenge, the transition from survival to reintegration into the rest of the world. The cold no longer had its icy grip on them, but the emotional and psychological effects of their time in isolation remained, lingering like the frost that had once surrounded them. For months, the Arctic had been their entire reality. The cold, the routine, the camaraderie was all they had known. Their lives had been defined by the struggle to survive against an environment that seemed bent on breaking them. And while they had found ways to live within that harsh reality, they now had to face a new question. How do you go back to the real world after something so extreme? The end of their time in the Arctic wasn't a sudden, immediate shift, it was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The days stretched longer, and the freezing winds, though still present, weren't quite as harsh as they had been. The soldiers who had grown so accustomed to constant vigilance found themselves adjusting to a slower pace, one where the cold wasn't such an omnipresent force. But that didn't make the transition easier. In fact, it made it more complicated. Returning to normal life was difficult. The cold may have receded, but the psychological impact of living in such an extreme environment lingered. Soldiers who had been hyper-alert for so long now struggled to adapt to environments that didn't require the same kind of constant vigilance. The mental clarity that came with surviving the harsh conditions where every task had been a matter of life or death was no longer necessary, and the adjustment to a more relaxed way of life felt jarring. The constant need to fight for warmth, for rest, and for survival had been replaced with the need to find new meaning in a world that, though warmer, now seemed oddly distant. For some soldiers, the transition was harder than for others. Those who had spent the most time battling the cold often found themselves struggling with reintegration. They had become so focused on survival that when they returned to a more stable, predictable life, they felt adrift. There were moments of unease, even when surrounded by warmth and familiarity. The chaos of the Arctic, with its constant demands on the body and mind, had been replaced with the stillness of peace, which felt both a relief and an unfamiliar void. There was also the question of how to process the trauma of their experience. The cold, the isolation, and the constant fear of frostbite and death had created a shared experience that bound the soldiers together, but it also left emotional scars. For some, the horrors of the Arctic, while not as extreme as those in combat, still lingered in their minds. Sleep, which had been such a crucial and complex part of their survival, became a symbol of their time in the frozen wasteland. The memories of restless nights, of waking up cold and disoriented, haunted them even after they left the ice behind. In many ways, the return to normal life was a mental battlefield of its own. The soldiers who had once struggled to sleep in the freezing cold now struggled to sleep in the warmth of their homes. The absence of constant vigilance, the lack of routine, and the unfamiliar softness of a regular bed were all disorienting. The cold no longer physically surrounded them, but it had carved a place in their minds that no warmth could easily fill. As difficult as the adjustment was, there was also a profound sense of accomplishment. These soldiers had endured the worst that nature could throw at them, and they had come through it, not just alive, but stronger. They had learned how to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, how to adapt their bodies, minds, and spirits to the demands of the Arctic. And while the transition back to normal life was difficult, it wasn't without its rewards. The strength they had built, both physically and emotionally, was a testament to their resilience. And then there were the friendships, the bonds formed in the Arctic. The relationships between the soldiers were one of the most important factors in their survival, and those bonds didn't disappear once they returned to civilian life. While they might have left the cold behind, they carried with them the lessons they had learned from each other. The shared moments of hardship, of laughter, of survival had forged deep connections that could never be broken. They had faced the cold together, and now they would face life beyond the Arctic together, supporting each other through the challenges of reintegration. The memories of the Arctic would never fade completely, but in time they would transform from a source of trauma to one of pride. The soldiers would look back on their time in the Arctic not as a period of suffering, but as a chapter of their lives that proved just how far they could push the limits of human endurance. They had come to understand that survival wasn't just about conquering the environment, it was about conquering the self, learning to trust in your ability to endure, to adapt, and to persevere, no matter how impossible the odds. As the soldiers reintegrated into society, their memories of the Arctic became part of their story. They carried with them the strength to face whatever life threw their way, knowing that they had survived the most brutal of circumstances and emerged stronger. Their ability to rest, to find moments of peace amid the chaos of their time in the Arctic, was a skill that would serve them for the rest of their lives. And so, the story of the Arctic air bases ends, not in defeat, but in triumph. The soldiers who served there had faced an enemy that no amount of training could prepare them for, nature at its most unforgiving. But in the end, they learned to live with it, to survive it, and, most importantly, to find strength in each other and in themselves. They learned that sleep wasn't just a necessity, was a tool of survival, a way to reset, to recover, and to prepare for the battles that lay ahead in the end. Their time in the Arctic was more than a chapter of their military service, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that no matter how harsh the environment, No matter how overwhelming the challenge, we are capable of surviving and thriving. The Arctic may have been the harshest of tests, but in the end, it was a test they passed, and the lessons they learned there would stay with them forever, guiding them through whatever life threw their way. As the soldiers made their way back from the Arctic, each man carried with him a unique story of endurance, of surviving an environment that demanded everything from them, body and mind. The transition back to the relative comforts of civilian life or a less brutal front was not easy, and while they were physically free from the Arctic's icy grasp, they knew deep down that the scars of their experience, both mental and emotional, would remain with them for a lifetime. But it wasn't just the struggle to survive that defined their time in the Arctic. It was the perseverance, the lessons learned in the most extreme of circumstances, and the camaraderie that kept them from breaking under the weight of it all. The shift from constant vigilance and survival mode to a life where the cold wasn't your ever-present enemy was jarring. The very nature of their survival had been built around staying alert at all times, to be constantly aware of the cold, the shifting snow, and the possibility of frostbite or even death. To transition from that kind of hyper-awareness to a world where the dangers were no longer so immediate could make everything feel a bit empty. The soldiers had spent months in the trenches of their minds, surviving physically, emotionally, and mentally under the strain of the Arctic. Coming back to something that seemed almost too comfortable, safe even, was disorienting. But the bonds they had formed during their time in the Arctic were far from fragile, even though they had faced one of the most difficult environments known to man. The strength of their unity had seen them through. That unity didn't disappear when the cold finally thawed. It transformed. The friendships and connections that had been made while huddled around a small stove or sharing stories during long, dark nights became the lifeline for these soldiers as they reintegrated back into society. They would forever share a unique understanding, a knowing glance, and a connection that no one else could understand. In fact, it was this camaraderie that became the centerpiece of their post-Arctic lives. They had been through something few others could relate to, and it made them both stronger and more compassionate. They knew what it meant to endure the harshest conditions, and they understood the value of a shared experience. This camaraderie didn't just bind them during their time in the Arctic, it followed them throughout their lives. Whenever they gathered, even long after their time on the airbase had ended, the memories of the cold would flood back, and with it, a sense of gratitude for having made it through together. What the soldiers took away from the Arctic was more than just survival skills, it was a mindset. They had learned how to adapt, how to endure, and how to find strength in each other. And perhaps more importantly, they had learned how to rest, how to allow their bodies and minds to recover from the unimaginable toll that the cold had taken. They had figured out that rest wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The ability to take a moment to recharge, to sleep when they could, had been just as important as any physical defense against the cold. As the years passed, the memories of the Arctic would become less about the freezing temperatures and more about the lessons learned. The cold, the isolation, the desperate battle against the elements, they were all part of a story that was slowly becoming a part of their past. What remained, however, was the understanding that they had endured something few could ever fully grasp. They had lived through the worst of it and had emerged stronger. They had learned to find peace in the midst of the chaos, to adapt and to survive, and that made them resilient in ways they never imagined. When the soldiers thought back on their time in the Arctic, it wasn't just the cold they remembered, it was the camaraderie, the quiet moments of shared strength, the small victories of survival. It was about the ways they had learned to thrive in the most difficult of conditions, to support one another through the toughest of times, and to never give up. The struggle to sleep in a world where the cold seemed intent on stealing away any chance for rest became a metaphor for their lives. No matter how harsh the world was, they found a way to endure. And no matter how freezing the environment, they had learned to sleep, to recover, to find strength in rest. For those soldiers who spent their time in the Arctic, the experience had become an indelible part of their identity. They didn't just survive the cold, they transformed it into a tool for growth. They had come to understand that the cold wasn't something to be defeated. It was something to be respected. The Arctic had tested their limits, pushed them beyond what they thought possible, and in doing so, had proven that there was no obstacle too great for the human spirit to overcome. And as they moved on with their lives, the lessons from the Arctic stayed with them. They had learned that life could be as unpredictable and as unforgiving as the cold itself. But with determination, camaraderie, and the ability to adapt, there was no challenge too great. The cold may have dominated the Arctic, but the soldiers had dominated it in their own way. They had mastered it, and in doing so, they had mastered themselves as they stepped away from their time in the Arctic. Back into the warmth of everyday life, they carried with them a quiet strength, a pride in what they had endured, and the knowledge that there was no challenge too impossible to face. They had not only survived the Arctic, they had become stronger for having faced it. And they knew, deep down, that whatever came next, they would be ready for it, just as they had been ready for the cold. The years that followed the soldiers' time in the Arctic were a mix of adaptation, healing, and reflection. As the world around them changed and new chapters of their lives unfolded, the lessons they learned in the frozen wilderness remained an integral part of who they were. But as they reintegrated into society, they quickly realized that while they had mastered the art of surviving the Arctic, they hadn't fully escaped its emotional and psychological effects. The cold, in a sense, was always there, lingering just below the surface. Even in the warmth of their homes, the mental scars of their time in the Arctic persisted. It wasn't something that could be shaken off. It wasn't something they could just forget. The long nights, the constant vigilance, and the toll it took on their bodies and minds stayed with them, forming a subtle but persistent undercurrent to their daily lives. The cold had been a constant companion, and while it no longer physically surrounded them, it continued to haunt their memories. At times, they found themselves waking up in the middle of the night, their hearts racing, the feeling of the Arctic cold creeping into their skin once again. It wasn't that they were still physically cold, it was the psychological echo of that environment. The feeling of being trapped in a place where there was no escape, where survival was a daily struggle. They would shake it off and try to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered. It wasn't something that could be easily brushed aside. It was in these quiet moments, in the depths of their minds, that the true weight of their experience in the Arctic came to the surface. They had lived through it all, endured the cold, the isolation, and the constant threat of freezing to death. They had survived, yes, but in the silence of the night, they felt the weight of all they had experienced. It was a quiet kind of trauma, one that didn't show on the surface, but was ever present in their subconscious. Yet, despite these lingering effects, the soldiers learned how to live with them. They found ways to adapt, just as they had adapted in the Arctic. They learned how to talk about their experiences, to share the memories, and to find solace in their shared survival. The camaraderie they had formed in the Arctic was one of the greatest sources of healing. They reached out to each other, reconnecting, sharing stories, and offering support. The bonds they had formed were unbreakable, and in those moments of connection, they found peace. The soldiers also learned how to take care of themselves in ways they hadn't before. They had been so focused on surviving in the Arctic that they had neglected their mental and emotional well-being. Now, they recognized the importance of healing, of giving themselves permission to rest, to reflect, and to rebuild. They sought therapy, talked to professionals, and found ways to cope with the trauma of their experiences. It was a process, a long, difficult journey, but it was one that allowed them to move forward. And as they began to heal, they also found that their time in the Arctic had taught them something invaluable: the power of perspective. They had endured something so extreme, something so life-altering, that everything else in their lives seemed to pale in comparison. The daily struggles they had faced in the Arctic, the fear, the cold, the isolation, it all made the challenges of civilian life seem less daunting. They had learned that no matter how difficult life got, they could face it just as they had faced the Arctic. The cold might have been their enemy, but it had also been their teacher. It had shown them the limits of their strength and the depths of their resilience. As they moved forward in life, they became leaders in their communities, mentors to others who were struggling with their own battles. They had learned the value of perseverance, of finding strength in the face of adversity, and they shared that knowledge with those around them. They understood that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about thriving, even in the harshest of environments. The soldiers who had spent their time in the Arctic were not defined by the cold, nor by the challenges they faced. They were defined by their ability to adapt, to grow, and to rebuild. The Arctic had been a place that tested them, but it had also shaped them into people who could face anything. And in that transformation, they had found not just survival, but strength, wisdom, and purpose. As the years went by, their experiences became stories that they would tell to their children, to their grandchildren. Stories of resilience, of survival, and of the strength of the human spirit. And in telling these stories, they ensured that the lessons of the Arctic would never be forgotten. The cold, the isolation, the nights that felt endless, all of it was part of their legacy. They had endured, and in doing so, they had become something greater than survivors. They had become a living testament to the power of the human spirit. And so, as they entered the later years of their lives, these soldiers knew one thing above all else: they had been tested in ways few could imagine, and they had come through, stronger than they ever thought possible. The Arctic may have been one of the harshest environments known to man, but it had shown them the depth of their own strength. And in that, they had found peace. As they looked back on their time in the Arctic, they could now see it not just as a trial to be endured, but as a part of their journey, one that had shaped them, taught them, and ultimately made them who they were. It was a chapter that would never be forgotten, a part of their story that would live on, inspiring others for generations to come. As time marched on, the soldiers who had survived the Arctic air bases found themselves not just survivors, but also mentors and pillars of strength within their communities. Their journey through the cold had changed them in ways that extended far beyond physical endurance. It had shaped their perspectives on life itself. The challenges they had faced and the resilience they had shown became a model for others. And though the cold was a chapter of their lives now buried in the past, the lessons they had learned from those freezing nights continued to resonate, providing a foundation of strength as they faced the trials of civilian life. One of the most powerful lessons they carried with them was the importance of connection. In the Arctic, they had learned that isolation could be both a physical and mental enemy, and yet it was also within the bonds formed in the darkest moments that they found the strength to continue. even though they had faced the cold together. They also realized that they could face the future by leaning on each other. They understood that true survival wasn't just about enduring the elements, it was about enduring together. And so, the bonds formed in the Arctic endured well beyond the time they spent in that frozen landscape. Soldiers who had once been strangers now remained lifelong friends, each one carrying a piece of the other's strength. The shared experience of survival created an unbreakable connection that transcended time and distance. They met regularly, reminiscing about the hardship they had faced, but also celebrating how far they had come since those brutal days. They shared their victories, their triumphs over ordinary life, knowing that the Arctic had already pushed them to their limits and they had come through it. But even as they found solace in each other's company, they also began to look outward to help others who faced struggles of their own. The lessons of perseverance, adaptability, and mental fortitude that the Arctic had instilled in them were lessons they wanted to pass on. Many of these soldiers found ways to become community leaders, sharing their knowledge of how to overcome adversity. They mentored younger generations, teaching them not just how to survive, but how to thrive in difficult times. They knew that the challenges they faced in the Arctic, while extreme, were not so different from the everyday struggles that people faced in the real world. Whether it was overcoming personal hardships, dealing with loss, or navigating difficult circumstances, the soldiers knew that the key to overcoming adversity lay in one's mental resilience. As time went on, many of these veterans became local heroes, silent giants who had once faced the most unforgiving elements in the world and emerged stronger for it. Their stories became a source of inspiration, not just for their peers, but for younger generations who were learning how to navigate their own challenges. The lessons they imparted weren't grand or flashy. They were simple and grounded in the realities of their own survival. They taught that strength wasn't about toughness alone, but about the willingness to adapt, to rely on those around you, and to never give up even when it seemed impossible. In their later years, many of these soldiers found themselves reflecting not on the hardships they had faced, but on the resilience that had carried them through. They had learned to survive, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. And this understanding allowed them to not only face the challenges of their past, but also to embrace the future with the same unshakable confidence they had once relied on. To endure the Arctic. It was in their quiet moments of reflection that they truly understood the depth of their own transformation. The soldiers who had once feared the cold now looked back at their time in the Arctic with a sense of pride, not because of the hardship they had endured, but because of the strength they had discovered within themselves. They had faced one of the harshest environments in the world and had not just survived, but had grown in the process. The cold had tested them, but it had also shaped them into something greater than they had ever imagined. As they aged, the memories of the Arctic continued to surface. The cold, the isolation, the days that seemed endless, those moments remained in the back of their minds, but they no longer felt like burdens. Instead, they had become lessons etched into their souls. The soldiers no longer feared the cold or the dark nights. They had learned that no matter what came their way, they could handle it. They had learned that there was always a way forward, even in the bleakest moments. In their final years, many of the veterans gathered to share their stories once again, as they had done many times before. These reunions, while somber, were also filled with laughter. They would speak of their experiences in the Arctic, not as a hardship, but as a chapter of their lives that had made them who they were. They had learned to find peace, even in the coldest of places, and now, surrounded by the warmth of old friends and fellow survivors, They understood that they had, in fact, conquered the Arctic in the most important way possible. The harsh, frozen air bases were no longer a place of terror or struggle for these soldiers. They had transformed them into a part of their identity, and in doing so, they had created a legacy of resilience that would outlast them. It was a legacy of survival, of adapting to the most extreme conditions, and of finding strength not just in the face of adversity, but in the relationships they had formed along the way. The Arctic had shaped them, but it had also revealed the depths of their strength, the power of human connection, and the incredible ability to endure. And as the years passed, these veterans remained a living testament to the fact that no matter how cold, how dark, or how isolated the world may seem, the human spirit has the power to survive, adapt, and rise above it all. Asterisk, as the surviving veterans of the Arctic continued to age, their stories grew into legends. The experience of enduring the coldest, most isolating environment known to man became not only a defining chapter in their own lives, but also a profound example for those who would come after them. In time, their legacy transcended the icy landscapes they had survived. It became a symbol of what human resilience, adaptation, and connection could accomplish, even in the most dire circumstances. In their later years, these men often found themselves reflecting on their experiences, not with bitterness, but with an almost serene understanding of how far they had come. The cold, once an ever-present and suffocating adversary, no longer held the same power over them. Instead, it had become a part of their identity, a trial they had passed through and emerged stronger for. In the quiet moments of their lives, they no longer shivered at the thought of winter or the dark, long nights. They had, in many ways, already conquered them, not by brute strength or force, but by learning to live with them, to find purpose. Even in the coldest, most unforgiving conditions, these veterans, once cold and isolated in the Arctic, found warmth not just in their shared experiences, but in the generations that followed. Their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren came to learn about the sacrifices and challenges they had faced, often in ways that the younger generation could scarcely comprehend. To the younger generations, the story of the Arctic soldiers was almost mythical, an era of hardship and perseverance that seemed so far removed from the relative comforts of modern life. And yet, it was these stories, these accounts of survival against all odds, that shaped the values of the next generation. The impact of the soldiers' time in the Arctic extended far beyond their personal experiences. Their lessons in resilience, community, and mental fortitude became part of the fabric of their families and communities. Their children and grandchildren learned from their strength and adopted the same tenacity in their own struggles. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving in the face of adversity, finding light even when surrounded by darkness. They carried forward the lessons of survival, not as a burden, but as a guide to overcoming challenges of their own. Though the Arctic had once been a symbol of isolation and terror, it gradually became a symbol of triumph as the soldiers took ownership of their experience. What had been a fight for survival became a source of pride. They no longer saw the cold as something that had defeated them, but as something that had shaped them into who they were. They had learned, in the face of adversity, that there was nothing they couldn't overcome. But even as the veterans grew older and their time to reflect on those cold days drew to a close, they remained acutely aware of the importance of remembering what they had gone through, not just for themselves, but for the generations that had not lived through such trials. They knew that the story of the Arctic was one that had to be shared, not just as a tale of hardship, but as a story of human strength, adaptability, and the unbreakable will to survive. They wanted to ensure that the lessons they had learned would continue to resonate, that future generations would understand the sacrifices that had been made in the name of survival. As their stories reached new ears, the sense of pride and respect for what they had endured only grew. The hardships of the Arctic, once a painful memory, became something to be honored, not just feared. The veterans had transformed their struggles into a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could be accomplished when human resilience was pushed to its limits. Even as they faced the twilight years of their lives, the veterans found peace in the knowledge that their legacy was secure. They had conquered the Arctic not just physically, but in the way they had transformed an environment designed to break them into one that had shaped them into something stronger. It was no longer just about surviving the cold. It was about having the strength to thrive in the face of it. Their final years were spent sharing their stories, passing on the lessons of their survival, and ensuring that their experiences would never be forgotten. They were no longer the soldiers frozen in the ice, but the men who had triumphed over the cold, who had proven that no matter the challenge, the human spirit could endure. In their final moments, the cold was no longer their adversary. It was a part of their history, and it had helped create a legacy of strength, unity, and hope. The veteran's story became part of the fabric of history, one of perseverance and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They had survived the Arctic, and in doing so, they had proven that survival wasn't just was about adapting, finding meaning, and pushing through the hardest of times with the knowledge that, no matter what, you could always find a way to survive. The cold would never truly leave them. It would remain a part of them forever, as both a challenge and a triumph. But the soldiers who had faced it never saw it as a threat anymore. It had become, in the end, just another part of their journey, and that journey would continue to inspire for generations to come. Asterisk, as the surviving veterans of the Arctic continued to age, their stories grew into legends. The experience of enduring the coldest, most isolating environment known to man became not only a defining chapter in their own lives, but also a profound example for those who would come after them. In time, their legacy transcended the icy landscapes they had survived. It became a symbol of what human resilience, adaptation, and connection could accomplish, even in the most dire circumstances. In their later years, these men often found themselves reflecting on their experiences, not with bitterness, but with an almost serene understanding of how far they had come. The cold, once an ever-present and suffocating adversary, no longer held the same power over them. Instead, it had become a part of their identity, a trial they had passed through and emerged stronger for. In the quiet moments of their lives, they no longer shivered at the thought of winter or the dark, long nights. They had, in many ways, already conquered them, not by brute strength or force, but by learning to live with them, to find purpose, even in the coldest, most unforgiving conditions. These veterans, once cold and isolated in the Arctic, found warmth not just in their shared experiences, but in the generations that followed. Their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren came to learn about the sacrifices and challenges they had faced, often in ways that the younger generation could scarcely comprehend. To the younger generations, the story of the Arctic soldiers was almost mythical, an era of hardship and perseverance that seemed so far removed from the relative comforts of modern life. And yet, it was these stories, these accounts of survival against all odds, that shaped the values of the next generation. The impact of the soldiers' time in the Arctic extended far beyond their personal experiences. Their lessons in resilience, community, and mental fortitude became part of the fabric of their families and communities. Their children and grandchildren learned from their strength and adopted the same tenacity in their own struggles. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving in the face of adversity, finding light even when surrounded by darkness. They carried forward the lessons of survival, not as a burden, but as a guide to overcoming challenges of their own though. The Arctic had once been a symbol of isolation and terror. It gradually became a symbol of triumph as the soldiers took ownership of their experience. What had been a fight for survival became a source of pride. They no longer saw the cold as something that had defeated them, but as something that had shaped them into who they were. They had learned, in the face of adversity, that there was nothing they couldn't overcome. But even as the veterans grew older and their time to reflect on those cold days drew to a close, they remained acutely aware of the importance of remembering what they had gone through, not just for themselves, but for the generations that had not lived through such trials. They knew that the story of the Arctic was one that had to be shared, not just as a tale of hardship, but as a story of human strength, adaptability, and the unbreakable will to survive. They wanted to ensure that the lessons they had learned would continue to resonate, that future generations would understand the sacrifices that had been made in the name of survival. As their stories reached new ears, the sense of pride and respect for what they had endured only grew. The hardships of the Arctic, once a painful memory, became something to be honored, not just feared. The veterans had transformed their struggles into a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could be accomplished when human resilience was pushed to its limits. Even as they faced the twilight years of their lives, the veterans found peace in the knowledge that their legacy was secure. They had conquered the Arctic not just physically, but in the way they had transformed an environment designed to break them into one that had shaped them into something stronger. It was no longer just about surviving the cold. It was about having the strength to thrive in the face of it. Their final years were spent sharing their stories, passing on the lessons of their survival, and ensuring that their experiences would never be forgotten. They were no longer the soldiers frozen in the ice, but the men who had triumphed over the cold, who had proven that no matter the challenge, the human spirit could endure. In their final moments, the cold was no longer their adversary. It was a part of their history, and it had helped create a legacy of strength, unity, and hope. The veteran's story became part of the fabric of history, one of perseverance and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They had survived the Arctic, and in doing so, they had proven that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about adapting, finding meaning, and pushing through the hardest of times with the knowledge that, no matter what, you could always find a way to survive. The cold would never truly leave them. It would remain a part of them forever, as both a challenge and a triumph. But the soldiers who had faced it never saw it as a threat anymore. It had become, in the end, just another part of their journey, and that journey would continue to inspire for generations to come. You lie in your bunk, bundled so tightly in layers of wool and fur that you barely feel like a human anymore, more like a cocoon of damp fabric that smells faintly of kerosene. The Arctic base is silent, except for the occasional groan of the wind against the walls, a low hum of the stove's embers, and the creak of timber that threatens to snap under the pressure of frost. Just when you think you might drift into something resembling sleep, the door bursts open with a blast of freezing air, and in shuffles the medical officer with his clipboard. His boots crunch on the frozen floorboards, and his lantern beam slices through the haze of condensation like a searchlight. Frostbite check, he mutters, his breath visible, even indoors. Every soldier in the barracks groans in unison. It's not that you don't appreciate the Kerno one wants to lose a toe, but being yanked out of your fragile cocoon of warmth feels like punishment. You peel back your blankets and extend stiff hands for inspection, watching your bunkmate do the same. The officer shines his light on fingers, toes, noses, and ears, looking for telltale patches of pale or bluish skin. If you've gone numb without realizing it, that patch could mean the beginning of dead flesh. Nobody wants to be that guy. It's a strangely humiliating ritual. Imagine a doctor poking around your socks in the middle of the night while you pray your toes still resemble meat instead of chalk. You wiggle them in demonstration, trying to prove to yourself as much as to him that they're still attached and working. Sometimes he nods quickly and moves on. Sometimes he squints suspiciously. A few unlucky men have been pulled from bed, ordered to warm their feet by the stove under supervision until blood flow returns. The irony is that the stove itself is no guarantee. Feed it too much coal, and the place becomes an oven dripping with condensation. Let it slack, and the barracks instantly turn into a walk-in freezer. Somewhere between those extremes lies a sweet spot, and no soldier ever manages to keep it there consistently. The frostbite patrols exist because soldiers often misjudge the balance. One moment you're sweating, the next your skin is burning from the cold. There's an official term for these nightly interruptions: preventive medicine. Military memos described it as essential for maintaining operational strength in extreme climates. In less official words, it meant dragging yourself half-conscious out of your meager warmth so a tired medic could make sure you hadn't started turning into a popsicle. You couldn't even get mad about it, because soldiers who ignored the checks often paid in digits. Frostbite wasn't some distant fear. It was as common as the flu. One careless nap without boots, one night where you loosened your socks, and you could wake up with toes blackening beyond recovery. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these checks. Some argue they prevented mass cases of frostbite, saving countless men from amputations. Others claim the constant disruption of sleep made soldiers so exhausted that their overall performance suffered anyway. Imagine being half-rested at best, night after night, and then stumbling out into the snow at dawn to load munitions or guard the perimeter. Would a few saved toes really balance out an army of chronically sleep-deprived men? The records don't offer a neat answer, and veterans themselves gave conflicting testimonies. One quirky detail you'd never expect: soldiers often used socks as conversation starters during inspections. When the medic pulled up a blanket, he might find wool socks layered over silk ones, silk often mailed from home as a luxury gift. Others wore mismatched colors, stolen from supply crates or traded with comrades. It became almost a badge of personality, what you chose to wrap your feet in. One man even cut strips from a parachute and wrapped them around his toes, swearing the fabric kept frostbite away better than anything the quartermaster issued. Nobody could prove him wrong. Then there were the toe whispers. Some men swore by talking to their feet before bed, telling them to hang in there or stay alive. It sounds ridiculous, but in a place where frostbite was a daily roulette, superstition carried weight. You start whispering too, even if just to feel like you're in control. After all, who's going to judge you? Everyone else is probably mumbling pep talks to their extremities too. The inspections weren't just about toes and fingers. Medics sometimes made you open your mouth so they could check for cracked lips and gums bleeding from scurvy. Yes, Scurvy, something you thought belonged to pirates, not 20th century soldiers, but in the Arctic, where fresh fruit was rarer than a warm shower, vitamin deficiency haunted every barracks. To fight it, the US military issued lemon or lime juice concentrate, but it often froze solid before you could drink it. Soldiers joked that scurvy would take them before Hitler ever did. Sleep after inspection was always a gamble. Some nights, you managed to burrow back into warmth. Other nights you shivered so violently the thin mattress rattled beneath you. You'd think the human body would adjust, but adaptation in the Arctic was never complete. The cold always won a little. Even your dreams became tinged with imagining fireplaces that never warmed, or beaches where the sand turned to snow beneath your feet. And yet, you endure, because every man in the barracks endures. There's a strange camaraderie in lifting your toes to the same flashlight and listening to the same gruff voice bark next. As the medic moves down the line, you begin to laugh about it, to joke that someday you'll tell your children, "I survived nightly sock inspections in the Arctic." They'll probably roll their eyes, not realizing that those ridiculous rituals might have been the only reason you kept all 10 toes. So you close your eyes again, pulling the blanket tight around your chin, trying not to breathe too heavily, lest your own condensation drip back onto your nose. You wiggle your feet under the covers, not in prayer this time, but in reassurance. They're still there, still alive. And if the frostbite patrol comes back around, you'll show them off like trophies. The wind outside howls like a living thing, rattling the wooden walls of the barracks with a rhythm that could almost lull you to sleep if it weren't so bone-deep cold. You lie there, still thinking about the frostbite inspection, when your mind drifts to how soldiers first learned to cope in this brutal land. The truth is, most of what you do here isn't invented by the army at all. It's borrowed, adapted, sometimes clumsily, from the people who actually know how to live in the Arctic, the Inuit. When the base was first built, officers were baffled by how quickly soldiers' gear failed them. Wool socks froze stiff, boots cracked, and mittens offered little protection against wind that sliced like knives. Then someone noticed the Inuit hunters, dressed head to toe in fur parkas, moving effortlessly across the tundra. They weren't shivering. They weren't fighting frostbite every night. They had secrets worth stealing. And so, suddenly, soldiers began to swap out regulation issue gear for parkas stitched with caribou hide, boots lined with sealskin, and mitts so thick you could barely move your fingers. But you stayed warm enough to keep them. You tugged your blanket tighter and imagine yourself in one of those fur parkas. The hood comes up so far it creates a tunnel of warmth, lined with frost-rimmed fur that traps your breath. Inuit seamstresses designed the garments so moisture wicked outward, not inward. By contrast, the army's heavy wool often locked in, sweat turning your own body heat into icy prison bars. Soldiers quickly learned a fur parka wasn't just clothing, it was survival. Shelters, too, took on Inuit influence. You'd think sleeping in a wooden barracks or a tent would be better than an igloo, but not always. A dome of snow, properly built, insulated better than many of the drafty huts the army threw together in haste. Some soldiers, desperate during blizzards, copied Inuit techniques, carving blocks of packed snow, stacking them in spirals, sealing cracks with loose powder. Inside, the temperature could rise above freezing simply from body heat and a small lamp. It sounds modest, but after marching in 40 air, above freezing felt like summer. Yes, the lamps. Inuit families used seal oil lamps, small, stone vessels with a wick of moss or dried fibers. When lit, they glowed with a steady flame, releasing both heat and light. To the soldiers, who relied on sputtering kerosene heaters that filled rooms with smoke, these lamps seemed almost magical. Stories spread of soldiers who managed to acquire one, warming their tent with a clean glow that didn't reek of chemicals. One man swore the lamp kept frost from forming on his boots overnight, something no stove ever accomplished. Historians still argue whether the US military officially encouraged borrowing these methods or whether it happened quietly, soldier to soldier. Official manuals eventually included Eskimo-style techniques, but early on, officers sometimes resisted, insisting men stick to standard gear. Was it pride, bureaucracy, or simple ignorance? The debate continues, and it's a reminder that survival knowledge doesn't always flow from the top. Down it often bubbles up from the ground, learned painfully by those who actually freeze. A quirky detail you'd never expect. Soldiers sometimes traded candy bars or canned goods with Inuit families for clothing repairs. Imagine handing over a Hershey bar in exchange for a pair of fur mittens stitched to perfection. To the Inuit, the chocolate was exotic luxury. To you, the mittens were the difference between frostbitten fingers and typing a letter home with ease. Everyone won. Well, except for the supply officer who wondered why his chocolate rations kept disappearing. You shift on your thin mattress, remembering the first time you slipped into fur boots. At first, they felt clumsy, big, heavy, more like wearing furry buckets than shoes. But the warmth was undeniable. Your toes didn't sting with cold, and the bottoms, often made from sealskin, gripped the ice better than any leather sole. Soon enough, every soldier wanted a pair. Some even mailed desperate letters home, asking families to send fur from stateside, as if anyone in Kansas had a spare sealskin lying around. The cultural exchange went beyond clothing and shelters. Inuit guides taught soldiers how to read snow, how to spot soft drifts that could collapse, how to find hard-packed ridges safe enough to cross. They showed how to dig trenches in snow for wind protection, how to recognize the faint shimmer of thin ice over frozen lakes. These weren't tricks you found in training manuals. They were lifelines whispered from one generation to another. Still, not every soldier embraced the wisdom. Some clung stubbornly to army-issue blankets, sneering at native tricks. They usually learned the hard way, limping into the medical hut with blackened ears or swollen fingers. You couldn't argue with frostbite. It was the Arctic's final authority, and so, night after night, as you burrowed deeper into borrowed methods maybe, sleeping under a fur pelt instead of another itchy wool blanketu, realize this war isn't just fought with guns and bombs. It's fought with parkas, with lamps, with the quiet knowledge of people who've lived here long before your army ever arrived. You exhale into the cold air, watching your breath crystallize, and smile faintly. If the frostbite patrol comes tonight, you'll show them your toes against hill warm, still alive, thanks in no small part to wisdom borrowed from those who never called it survival. To them, it was just life. As the surviving veterans of the Arctic continued to age, their stories grew into legends. The experience of enduring the coldest, most isolating environment known to man became not only a defining chapter in their own lives, but also a profound example for those who would come after them. In time, their legacy transcended the icy landscapes they had survived. It became a symbol of what human resilience, adaptation, and connection could accomplish. Even in the most dire circumstances, in their later years, these men often found themselves reflecting on their experiences, not with bitterness, but with an almost serene understanding of how far they had come. The cold, once an ever-present and suffocating adversary, no longer held the same power over them. Instead, it had become a part of their identity, a trial they had passed through and emerged stronger, for in the quiet moments of their lives, they no longer shivered at the thought of winter or the dark, long nights. They had, in many ways, already conquered them, not by brute strength or force, but by learning to live with them, to find purpose, even in the coldest, most unforgiving conditions. These veterans, once cold and isolated in the Arctic, found warmth not just in their shared experiences, but in the generations that followed. Their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren came to learn about the sacrifices and challenges they had faced, often in ways that the younger generation could scarcely comprehend. To the younger generations, the story of the Arctic soldiers was almost mythical, an era of hardship and perseverance that seemed so far removed from the relative comforts of modern life. And yet, it was these stories, these accounts of survival against all odds, that shaped the values of the next generation. The impact of the soldiers' time in the Arctic extended far beyond their personal experiences. Their lessons in resilience, community, and mental fortitude became part of the fabric of their families and communities. Their children and grandchildren learned from their strength and adopted the same tenacity in their own struggles. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving in the face of adversity, finding light even when surrounded by darkness. They carried forward the lessons of survival, not as a burden, but as a guide to overcoming challenges of their own. Though the Arctic had once been a symbol of isolation and terror, it gradually became a symbol of triumph as the soldiers took ownership of their experience. What had been a fight for survival became a source of pride. They no longer saw the cold as something that had defeated them, but as something that had shaped them into who they were. They had learned, in the face of adversity, that there was nothing they couldn't overcome. But even as the veterans grew older and their time to reflect on those cold days drew to a close, they remained acutely aware of the importance of remembering what they had gone through, not just for themselves, but for the generations that had not lived through such trials. They knew that the story of the Arctic was one that had to be shared, not just as a tale of hardship, but as a story of human strength, adaptability, and the unbreakable will to survive. They wanted to ensure that the lessons they had learned would continue to resonate, that future generations would understand the sacrifices that had been made in the name of survival. As their stories reached new ears, the sense of pride and respect for what they had endured only grew. The hardships of the Arctic once, a painful memory, became something to be honored, not just feared. The veterans had transformed their struggles into a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could be accomplished when human resilience was pushed to its limits. Even as they faced the twilight years of their lives, the veterans found peace in the knowledge that their legacy was secure. They had conquered the Arctic not just physically, but in the way they had transformed an environment, designed to break them into one that had shaped them into something stronger. It was no longer just about surviving the cold. It was about having the strength to thrive in the face of it. Their final years were spent sharing their stories, passing on the lessons of their survival, and ensuring that their experiences would never be forgotten. They were no longer the soldiers frozen in the ice, but the men who had triumphed over the cold, who had proven that no matter the challenge, the human spirit could endure. In their final moments, the cold was no longer their adversary. It was a part of their history, and it had helped create a legacy of strength, unity, and hope. The veteran's story became part of the fabric of history, one of perseverance and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They had survived the Arctic, and in doing so, they had proven that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about adapting, finding meaning, and pushing through the hardest of times with the knowledge that, no matter what, you could always find a way to survive. The cold would never truly leave them. It would remain a part of them forever, as both a challenge and a triumph. But the soldiers who had faced it never saw it as a threat anymore. It had become, in the end, just another part of their journey, and that journey would continue to inspire for generations to come. Their story was no longer just about the cold, the isolation, or the pain. It was about the resilience that had allowed them to rise above it all. It was about the bonds they had formed, the friendships they had forged, and the understanding that no matter what life threw at them, they could face it with courage, determination, and the knowledge that they had already survived the worst. They had learned that the cold could only take so much from them. The rest was up to them, their hearts, their minds, and their will to keep going, no matter what. And so, as they passed from this world, their legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had heard their stories and learned from their example. The cold of the Arctic would never fully leave them, but they had mastered it, and in doing so, they had taught the world that no challenge, no matter how great, could ever break the human spirit. End of script. Sweet dreams.